I was just down in South Carolina at my mom's house, and I was going through some old photographs, and I came across this newspaper clipping of when I won first place in the local art contest in 6th grade, and I got to have my work displayed in the firehouse. And after 30 years of painting and exhibitions, I think that was still the most elating moment of my career. I was so excited I broke my arm. You can see I've got a cast on. And I remember they gave me a plaque that said Brian Rutenberg Hard Work Award. And the engraver made a mistake. It was supposed to say Artwork Award. But I kept it. I still have the plaque. And I can't think of a better summation of what it takes to be a painter. And I started to think about when it was that I was cognizant of the fact that I was becoming an artist. And I don't think one chooses to be an artist. I think it chooses you. And for me personally, I think it was in the 4th grade, even though I was drawing a lot as far back as the 1st grade. But there was something about, in the 4th grade, I started to discover that I was becoming my own best friend. And I think that's the most important bit of advice I can give to an artist, is to be your own best friend, to trust your gut, trust your instinct, to be comfortable in solitude, and to be comfortable in yourself. And I think all of those things in concert afford you the ability and the privilege to take risks. And I started to also think about what the word hard work entails. I work extremely hard, and I think being a painter is a critical job. But at the same time, it's also a tentacle of show business. There is one show business, and I work in it. And my hardest day is still easier than someone in another job's easiest day. I think about a job like a soldier or a fireman carrying 100 pounds of equipment up a burning staircase in 1,000-degree heat, or a doctor with a bleeding patient on the operating table. And suddenly it seems silly for me to be pissed off at cadmium orange. But being a painter is hard and critical in subtler ways, in other ways. Our job is culture. We're the dreamers, and every civilization needs dreamers. And we make the beautiful and the hideous collide at 100 miles an hour. We shoot arrows into your deepest, darkest private rooms. We seek beauty and truth in the everyday. And it's funny how little things change. In the 4th grade, I remember I was desperate inside. There was something burning, almost like the feeling of being really hungry, that made me want to say something, to express something. I needed to do something with everything that I felt inside. I needed to contain it in some way. And that desire, I'm 47 years old now, still remains unfulfilled. And I think that's what keeps me going, that desire that the next painting is going to satiate that, and it never does, and that's what keeps me going. There's something I discovered in the 4th grade that remains true today, and that's the fact that I feel the most like myself when I'm working. After I dropped my son off at school this morning, I was walking to the diner where I have breakfast every morning, and I passed a Starbucks, and in front there were a couple little dogs tied up to a bike stand. And as I walked by, nonchalantly, one of these little chicken shit dogs leapt out and bit me on the knee, causing me to jump over the curb into the street, almost into the path of an oncoming bus. And then I jumped back onto the sidewalk. And that whole horrific sequence of events in a split second got me thinking of intuition versus instinct vis-a-vis my paintings. And a guy recently wrote me an email on that topic, and we discussed that back and forth. And for me, intuition is far more important and far more integral in the process of making a painting. For me, intuition implies a complex of learned behaviors that are performed naturally, a kind of informed spontaneity, trusting my gut. And instinct, to me, implies the next time I see a gaggle of little shit dogs, I'm going to give them a wide berth and stay away. Every time I start a painting, all of the odds are on the painting sucking. And essentially, every step along the way is just trying to make it look less suckish. A painting is essentially a slow motion series of train wrecks, and you fix them, and then eventually the whole thing gets on the rails and then starts to take over. And intuition is a very important part of that process. I'm sometimes asked in lectures or in galleries what I think about when I'm painting, and the answer is nothing at all. I do first and I think second. For me, making a painting is essentially walking along the street trying to avoid dog bites. Walter Sickert, one of my favorite painters, said that in a painting you start like a bricklayer, you finish like a jeweler. So certainly there's intuition involved in that whole process, but as you move from the bricklaying part, the large, simple masses and shapes, into the jewel shape, the smaller, intricate parts, I find that cognitive thinking comes in a little bit more, and I love that later stage of the painting, of tinkering along. But painting itself is an entirely other form of thinking, so it's important not to pile on analytical, logical thinking on top of that. There's nothing worse than a painting that tries to do too many things. As Robert Ryman said, and I've quoted this before, all of the content is located in the tip of the brush. And the reason the content is located in the tip of the brush is because there isn't any room there for anything else. It's important to trust your gut and not make the painting try to do too much. When critics or writers write about my paintings, they sometimes use the term abstract expressionism, which I disagree with. I don't think of abstract expressionism as a style, only as a movement. And it really doesn't matter in what I'm saying here, because that's all press release, promotional, marketing terms. I'm speaking just as one painter to another. And although there are certain elements of the way that I work that are certainly analogous to the way that someone like de Kooning painted, especially in his early and middle period, or Franz Klein, or even a second generation Abex painter like Alfred Leslie or Grace Hartigan, in that there's a rigorous emphasis on authorship, on the hand of the artist being visible. There's a truth to materials. I'm very invested in the physical properties of oil paint. And there's a kind of aesthetic certainty that comes from antecedents, from one generation building on what came before it, which I suppose is an extension of modernism. And I still happen to believe that we're in modernism, we're just in a later phase of it. The painters that really turn me on, you have to dial the clock back a little further. For instance, a French academic painter like Pascal Dagnan-Bouveret, who lived from 1852 to 1929. Or his American contemporary, Thomas Wilmer Dewing, who lived from 1851 to 1938. And in this painting of Dewing's, which I love, it's called A Reading, there's a feeling of light and atmosphere and kind of a soulful mood. But there's also a feeling of weight and gravity and a declaration of placement, a real marking of location, which is all condensed down to the size of a diamond, which is represented in that vase sitting on the table in the foreground. And if I could split myself into three people, one of me would live in New York City, the second me would live in the deserts of Nevada, and the third me would live inside this vase. What I love about naturalism is, and I'll define naturalism, not as copying nature, but as the possession of that initial impulse in the face of nature. It's an empathy with the organic, as in the German definition of that word. And if you read a book like Abstraction and Empathy by Wilhelm Waringer, which I recommend, he talks about in the notion of empathy as starting with a certain emptiness, or a blankness, as I like to call it, until the viewer projects his or her vitality into the painting. That the painting is blank until there's a transference of egos. There's literally a grafting of identities, the viewer and the artist, through the mechanics of the work. I love that definition of empathy, and certainly between the two, abstraction and empathy, I side or feel more at home in the latter. I don't consider myself an abstract painter. I consider myself a landscape painter who arrives at my paintings through the process of abstraction. But certainly that all is bent through the lens of empathy. That's a very important component of my work. And as I grow and learn, I'm an avid student of art history. I find that I'm continually inventing and reinventing myself through the paintings that came before. I only think of myself as a painter when I'm not painting. I don't know if you feel this way, but when I'm painting, I tend to think of myself as something else entirely. A lonely desert hitchhiker, or a parlor magician, or a soccer player. It's only when I stop and back up from the painting that I remember that I'm a painter. Painting is so Neanderthal, so primitive. The implements that we use, the process of mark making, of stacking delicate layers of color to create an image, very Neanderthal. So when I'm painting, I'm so unconditionally invested in the process, in the ritual of work, that I don't think at all. And I say this all the time, it's so important when you're painting to do first and think second. Painting is an entirely different form of thought. And when I first started showing in group shows in high school and in early college, I never turned down the opportunity to show my work. But those shows tended to be in restaurants or in public libraries or in medical office lobbies, all in places where people were there to do something else. They were in a hurry to get from the elevator to the escalator for a meal or to return a book or have a rectal exam or whatever. So I knew that if I was going to get their attention, it had to be in a split second with very bold, concise, clear visual shapes. Very, very simple compositions and strong color contrasts and value contrasts. And if I could get their attention for a second, I would hopefully get them over to take a closer look. And that's what taught me, to this day, the template of creating composition with bold, clear visual information and strong color and contrast. And I know that the painting has to look good. That's the first part of impinging on the consciousness of the viewer, is visually. It has to look good from 25 feet away. You get your viewer thinking by first keeping them looking. And I was out having beers the other night with some friends, some artists, and we were talking about idea art versus retinal art, which Duchamp refers to. And the art world is so tribal. It's either this thing or that thing, this versus that. And of course, as a painter, it's visual, it's retinal, but a painting has to be conceptual. There has to be ideas. But I think it's important to remember that those ideas are suspended in visual material. That what Robert Ryman calls the content is located in the tip of the brush. Our allegiance, our job is to the eye, to do what Delacroix calls create a feast for the eye. So as I learned, 30 years ago, I have one split second to get your attention with visual information, to make it look good. And that's what I think Robert Rauschenberg understood so beautifully, or someone like Judy Chicago in her Dinner Party, or a sculptor like Janine Antoni, so deliciously visually beautiful, it keeps you looking. And then you can start to form that gradual connection where all of the other attendant parts of the experience of a painting can stick their suction cups on you. The thought, the conceptual framework, the ideas, the emotion, all of the other dimensions of a painting, but it has to look good first. As a painter, my job is to make things that look beautiful first.